Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And hopefully we'll have some time near the end of today's webinar to go through the audience questions. We also have 3 polling questions scattered throughout today's presentation, so please try to get involved as much as you can and answer those questions for us. And finally, at the end of today's webinar, we are doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Ship Apps Faster on AWS with unified visibility and security. Our speakers today are Jonah Jones, who's a Principal Solutions Architect at AWS, and Pavan Shankar, who is a Product Marketing Director at Sysdig. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. I'm so glad you guys are here with us today. Pavan, I know you are going to be kicking off the discussion, so I'm going to put myself on mute and let you get right at it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So on the agenda today, we have a lot of exciting things to talk about that Jonah and I will cover. First, Jonah will talk us through the AWS container landscape, give us an overview, and then we'll dive into more of the secure DevOps workflows for AWS, going into some use cases, some customer examples and stories, and then jumping into a demo to see the product in action, and then briefly covering who Sysdig is and why Sysdig appeals to a lot of customers when they're looking for container security and Kubernetes security solutions, and then have a brief Q&A to answer any questions that you might have. So with that, I'll let Jonah walk us through the AWS container landscape.
For sure. So at AWS, containers are in our blood in a way, right? We've been managing containers since 2015 with our first container launch, which was Amazon Elastic Container Service, or ECS. We've added additions to that, including ECR, EKS, and AWS Fargate in the past years. And so each of these are unique in a way. Amazon ECS is our proprietary container orchestration. Amazon EKS is our upstream version of Kubernetes that is still following all the upstream principles. And AWS Fargate is our serverless containers, which is a very popular choice for people who don't want to worry about managing infrastructure. So these are kind of some of like the baseline of container services. My guess is if you're on this call, then you're familiar with at least one of these. And if you're not, you can always check them out.
So that brings us to our first poll question, just to understand your environment today if you're running in AWS.
So we're going to go ahead and push out this first polling question, which is, what does your current containerized deployment in AWS look like? You can choose from EKS, ECS, Fargate on EKS, Fargate on ECS, or EC2. Go ahead and make your selection. And while everybody is doing that, just a quick reminder that we are taking questions at any time during the presentation. You do not have to wait until, it's easy for me to say, wait until we get to the question and answer period to submit your question. You can do that anytime. So please don't be shy if you've got a question for the speakers at any time during the presentation. Okay, looks like we have a fair number who have voted. I'm going to give you guys a couple more seconds before we go ahead and close things out and we take a look at the poll results. Okay, gonna go ahead and close them down in 3, 2, 1. And let's take a look at the results. Wow, looks like an overwhelming number are using EC2. So yeah, what does that tell you, Pavan?
Yeah, this is really interesting to see kind of the adoption. I mean, primarily being on EC2, and then EKS being the next kind of big component, I would have, and I was assuming that there'll be more Fargate. I mean, Jonah, do you have any kind
Yeah.
of thoughts there?
Yeah. I would have suspected EKS would have been our most popular, but I'm honestly not surprised. There are so things that aren't on this list are things like OpenShift, running your own orchestration platform, even if you run kops or a different way of running Kubernetes on your own, those would kind of all fall under EC2. So that kind of makes sense.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and hide these results and let you guys get back to your presentation.
Awesome, thank you.
Perfect. So we got to talk about Kubernetes when we're talking about containers, just because it is 2020. We have found at AWS that 84% of Kubernetes workloads that are running on public cloud run on AWS today. And so that can be anything from self-managed all the way to our managed offering, which is Amazon EKS, which is our fastest growing compute service ever in a 1-year period at this point. So it's definitely seen some massive adoption, but there are a lot of customers who are also doing hybrid or running their own because they want to be more up to date. So, Kubernetes is definitely important when we're talking about containers. We have to have a shout out for it today. And kind of talking back to the roots, right? If you take one step back from Kubernetes, we're talking about Docker, right? So Docker, the technology that came out in 2013 that really shaped the game of containers, right? We find that, it says container workloads, 80% of them run in AWS today. And then obviously Docker, the partner, and Docker, the technology, runs a lot of them, but so does things like Containerd or CRI-O. So we do see a lot of containers run in AWS in general as well. And when we talk about, containers, sometimes people just want to run their container, right? You are a developer or you're developing locally, you have Dockerfile, a Docker Compose, and you just want to get it working in the cloud, right? It's a POC, you want to get it public. AWS Fargate is definitely the most frictionless option at this point to get up and running with containers. There's no like spinning up control planes or clusters. And so we have seen that new customers, people who come to AWS for the first time, 40% of them actually are choosing Fargate because they make an app and they just want to get it up and running, ASAP, right? And Fargate has been the choice definitely for new customers. And it's kind of a no-brainer, right? We talked about some of the advantages, but if you're looking at like container adoption, a lot of things get covered out of the box for you by Fargate. So if you do one more animation here, I think it will show you. So what is really getting covered is you're not having to worry about cost and reserved instances. And one common misconception about Fargate is that it's expensive, and it was at launch. But nowadays, Fargate's actually the same price as an on-demand EC2 instance per vCPU. You get a lot of security built into the box. You get things like multi-tenancy built in for like different compliance standards, and obviously all the infrastructure is managed for you, and that includes things like patching, right? So Fargate comes with a lot of out-of-the-box benefits. And when we're talking about security, right, like obviously patching is just one layer of the onion. We like to think of this onion as the shared responsibility model at Amazon. And so we're going to look at it from EKS and Fargate, and we're going to see that there's not really too big of a difference. But what AWS is really responsible for is control plane. So, and for EKS, this is AZ backups and the security of the control plane. And you as a customer actually have all the hard stuff, right? Everything from the kernel of the host all the way to the in-memory data that is running within your containerized applications and everything in between. So networks, package management, RBAC, all of the hard stuff is still on the shoulders of the customer, right? So while we're talking about how easy Fargate is, you still have a lot you have to do when it comes to securing Fargate. It's not like Fargate magically solves all the security problems that were ever invented. We take out one little piece of the onion, which is host security, but you still have everything else in between, from building good Docker files to runtime to RBAC. And in particular, when we talk about why does security matter, right? Obviously, security slows down development, and how slow is debatable. But we have seen some data at AWS. We work with a lot of customers, and so we look at exploits. We see that 60% of organizations have had a security incident in the past year. This could be anything from you left a public container open and somebody found the EC2 metadata endpoint on it, to a Bitcoin miner installed on a host, any sort of incident that happens. And we find that some of these incidents are worse than others. And so if customer data gets out, we call this a breach, right? So this is an incident that turns into something more dangerous or more costly. And so the typical cost of a breach that happens is almost $4 million, right? So with 60% of small businesses, if they experienced a data breach, that would put them out of business within 6 months, right? $4 million is a huge hit if you're just starting out, right? And obviously we talk about container exploits and container breaches, but a lot of people think that's never going to happen to me, right? But what we are finding out is we look at some of the common breaches from these big companies we work with, and they're probably technologies that you have worked with in your company. Docker Hub, things that were considered validated images on Docker Hub, they got the check mark. They still had crypto mining software inside of them, right? That happens. Another one is if you use the Kubernetes dashboard, because you use Kubernetes, at one point there was a bug in it that allowed people to get your access keys from AWS through a cloud account credentials endpoint, right? So these are technologies that a lot of people use, and exploits happen. It's just the nature of software, right? So kind of understanding how we can limit the blast radius and how we can make sure that these incidents don't turn into exploits is really our goal.
Great. So that brings us to our next poll question.
All right, the next poll question is coming at you right now. The question is, which team owns the Container Kubernetes Security Initiative at your company? You can select from DevOps/Cloud Platform, DevSecOps, Security/InfoSec, or shared between DevOps and security. Go ahead and make your selection there. And just once again, quick reminder, folks, that if you have a question at any time, you can go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel to submit it. And hopefully we'll have a few minutes near the end of today's webinar to go through audience questions. And also, for those of you who might have to drop off or for some reason lose your connection and want to watch the webinar again, you will have the opportunity to do so, as we are going to be sending out an email after the event that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. So fear not, if you miss any of the webinar, you will be able to watch it again. All right, with that, let's go ahead and close out today's poll, the second polling question, and we'll take a look at the results. Here are the results. It looks like DevOps or cloud platform teams are responsible for the container Kubernetes security. Guys, what do you think about that result? It kind of makes sense to me, but want to get your take on it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this definitely resonates with us, where DevOps and the cloud platform teams are the ones that are usually responsible for any sort of container security initiatives within their companies.
Yeah, definitely. I come from an SRE background and before DevSecOps was really a term back in the 2017 days. I remember we had incidents. We would triage them immediately when we found out about them, and then we'd put a ticket on the Jira backlog to make sure it didn't happen again. And that was, it just kind of fell on the DevOps team, right? And I think that resonates across a lot of smaller startups as well, for sure.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to see the second biggest one was the shared between DevOps and security, which 30% is definitely a sizable proportion of who owns that initiative. So
yeah, security says what needs to be done, and DevOps actually has to get it done.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, we got
exactly what you mentioned, Jonah. That's a perfect segue into what we're also seeing as Sysdig in terms of the fact that DevOps must prioritize security, right? And we've analyzed over the last 2 years customer usage patterns and kind of found some key security insights. The first one is that oftentimes developers are overlooking vulnerabilities in their third-party libraries. So while they might be scanning their base OS images for OS vulnerabilities, oftentimes there are vulnerabilities that are introduced when they're pulling in third-party libraries like Python pip or Java jar and others when they're building the applications. And we found that over 53% of non-OS packages have high to critical CVEs. So that's something that is when it comes in terms of what actions you should take, you should make sure that you're scanning for both OS and non-OS vulnerabilities pre-deployment. The second kind of big component was around misconfigurations, and I think you talked about this a little bit. And I think AWS in general talks about how 99% or most misconfigurations are a result, or most errors in the cloud are a result of human misconfigurations or human oversight. And I think we see that in the container side as well, where 58% of your containers are running as root, potentially opening the door for container escapes and breakouts and other potential attacks. And then finally, there's no real record for container breaches. And what we found last year was that the average lifespan of a container that was running in production was about 5 minutes, which means that this is really difficult to, or it's easy for a bad actor to get in and exfiltrate some data and leave without you having the visibility into exactly what happened, right? And responding with an audit trail and having a record for that container breach, even after that container is gone, is something that's something that should be part of a DevOps and a DevSecOps workflow. So how do we turn this into practical steps as you think about embedding security into your DevOps workflows in AWS? Where you start with image scanning, right? We talked about those vulnerabilities. Automating this into your CI/CD pipeline, scanning your images in your registry is a great way for you to catch the bad things early and keep the bad out, essentially. And then next, ensuring that you have runtime security in place, detecting things like configuration drift, if someone exposing a port or running a container as root, or even just other anomalous activity that might be happening, someone spawning a shell in a container, you need to have the ability to detect that immediately and respond when that does occur. And then compliance is something that we often see as a key initiative as part of the container security strategy, where DevOps teams need to meet various controls like PCI or NIST or SOC 2, and want to make sure that, one, how do they map those controls to container environments? And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then how do you validate that on an ongoing basis? And then finally, that average lifespan, right, which is 5 minutes, means that you really need an incident response plan when something does go wrong in your container. So having the ability to respond with a full audit trail and a forensics record is something that's extremely critical and an essential capability as part of your container security strategy. So we'll go into each one of these in more detail now. So starting with image scanning, one of the ways we often tell customers is to think about image scanning both in pre-deployment and at runtime. So scanning wherever your images are is the philosophy, right? Where in the build phase, you're scanning directly in the pipeline. If you're using Jenkins or GitLab or Code Pipeline in AWS, scan images as they're being built. And then in the registry, if you're using ECR or Harbor or any other registry, any Docker V2 compatible registry, scanning your images that are in the registry as well. And then in Kubernetes, if you're using things like admission controllers, preventing the deployment of a risky image onto a cluster is something that you can do via an admission controller. And then this also serves as a great gate to deny any image from being deployed, where let's say a developer is in a bit of a hurry and bypasses the pipeline, but has access to the EKS cluster and wants to deploy something directly there. And then having an admission controller gate prevent that from happening is a great prevention mechanism, right? Preventing vulnerabilities getting in or just human oversight that might happen. And then at runtime also, right? Even though you might have checked off all these boxes pre-deployment, new vulnerabilities can come out or new things can happen, which means that you need to make sure you're scanning continuously at one time as well, and then identifying what those vulnerabilities are that are affecting your images and your applications, mapping them back to that specific service namespace, and then identifying the team that needs to fix it, right? Time is of the essence in runtime, so make sure that you can cover that last mile without having a developer or a security team figure out, okay, which vulnerability does this, tie back to. It's something that you want to make sure that you can have a proper workflow around. So ultimately, scanning wherever these images are is important. And then one other thing that I would say is what we're starting to see gaining more traction is inline scanning, which is essentially the capability to scan locally, whether in the pipeline or in the registry, and then only send the scanned results back to the third-party security tool, right? So this allows the customer to have full control of their image without sharing the image contents or exposing their registry credentials to a security vendor, thereby keeping all their images and PII data within their environment and have full control, and only sharing the metadata about the scan results out to the vendor. So they define the scanning policies, see the results and reports in a third-party tool like Sysdig, but then the scanning happens locally and they have full control of that, and nothing gets shared as part of their data. So how do we extend this towards Fargate workloads, right? We talked a little bit about Fargate that Jonah and I were talking about. We're seeing this starting to get adopted quite heavily in many environments, and a lot of interest that's being generated around Fargate. So let's talk about how you can scan your Fargate containers, where let's say a developer runs a Fargate tasks in a Fargate task using some base image. That task start event gets registered in an event bridge, for example, event stream, and then where Sysdig comes in is we are listening to that event stream and basically seeing and identifying the image that's being referenced. So the tag, the digest, all that kind of metadata about the image that's being referenced as part of that Fargate task, and then kicking off an ephemeral task in AWS via code build to scan that image that's being referenced, right? So the benefit again here is it's automated fully. So right after a trigger of a Fargate task, the process kicks off. It happens again, all kind of inline within your AWS cloud. You're not scanning or sending that image outside of your AWS cloud. Happens directly in your environment, and then it's using the native AWS services, right? Your DevOps teams are already using a workflow. This extends that workflow in AWS, and the only things you're sending out is the results, the reports, and you can analyze all of that in the Sysdig platform. So very unique. This is something that we just introduced as part of our launch end of September, and the only kind of unique Fargate scanning capability that's inline. We actually have a video on this, and you can do this in under 4 minutes. Pretty effective for teams that are deploying fast.
Yeah, this is cool.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just saying that's a really cool innovation, and it keeps, like you said, it keeps all the data in the customer account, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a big benefit, right? Whether it's compliance or a sensitive environment that customers want, to not share any access to.
Awesome.
And then the same thing, Jonah, we extended to ECR, an image in any image that's sitting in your ECR registry. The same model of scanning the image that's directly pushed to ECR, keeps your registry clean. Again, scans directly within the environment and only shares the metadata about the results back. So again, letting the customer have full control is a top priority from a security perspective, and it's just a better approach to scanning. So time for a story. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about this customer that's a Japanese ISP, really solving the problem of image scanning, where their environment, they were running really fast and adopting Kubernetes very quickly. So I think a lot of you guys that are listening can relate. Like once you start on EKS and adopting Kubernetes, it just kind of grows fast. And they wanted a tool that could support that speed of adoption. And looking at other security products, the big challenge was they didn't speak the language of Kubernetes, where they had mapped every single business unit to specific hierarchy in Kubernetes, where they had organized everything by a namespace, a deployment, a cluster, a pod, right? And kind of that was the hierarchy that they had mapped their business applications to, and wanted to, more importantly, surface vulnerabilities based on that hierarchy, so that they could say that this new vulnerability is tied to this cluster, this pod, right? And this team needs to fix it. And then also adding more advanced reporting capabilities saying any new CVE that has a fix available, is running longer than 30 days in this US East 1 region, right? Notify me and tell me which image that is, and doing this at scale. So when they use Sysdig, that was the benefit that they got, is not just scanning pre-deployment, but this is runtime, right? Reporting of vulnerabilities and saying, okay, this is where the last mile of this is where these vulnerabilities lie. This allowed them to pass audits faster, didn't impact the stability of the cluster. They're running this on massive number of nodes. Really helped them address kind of embed image scanning into their DevOps workflows. So just a quick kind of recap of before we jump to the next section, why Sysdig for image scanning. 3 key reasons. 1, better security with the inline scanning. So we're starting to see inline scanning in the pipeline and registry starting to become a catalyst for scanning more, actually, because people feel more comfortable. And this is starting to become more of the preferred approach rather than an alternative. And then identifying new vulnerabilities at runtime quickly by leveraging the context. This is the example from before where we're basically covering that last mile using the rich context from the Kubernetes environments, the labels, all automatically, and slicing your vulnerability information by that context, right? So you can figure out, okay, which team needs to fix this. And then finally getting the results fast by plugging into your workflows. So moving on, kind of next thing is runtime security after you address image scanning. And then the way we kind of think about runtime security for AWS is, our approach is to use the system calls and go into the kernel basically as that single source of truth, where a completely non-invasive instrumentation model allows us to deploy, an eBPF probe or open source kernel module that allows us to have full system call level visibility. So it's a kernel-based instrumentation. And the benefits here again is it's not invasive. You don't have a sidecar. You're not instrumenting your container. It's completely non-invasive. Allows you to scale. So you can have 100 or 1,000 containers, but you're deploying one agent, and then you have full, deep visibility because nothing can lie to the kernel, right? So that's the how you do workload security for either your EC2, ECS, EKS hosts that you're running on. And then beyond just the workload side of the runtime security, there's also the audit logs that serve as a great source of security data. So EKS, right, you may have users and workloads making API calls to EKS. Those interactions are getting logged in this audit log, which is automatically being ingested into Sysdig. And then you are able to write those detection rules against those audit logs that allow you to figure out, did someone store credentials in a config map versus secrets, or did someone exec into a pod, right? Where was that connection initiated from? Like, is someone escalating RBAC permissions? All these kinds of who did what in Kubernetes that comes from the audit logs via the API server is a great source of detection, logs that we can write rules off of. And again, all of these is sent back to Sysdig. So you can think about this as sort of the user level, the audit log, control plane side, plus the workload level that you get from the agent that ties together, builds a really nice Kubernetes security and audit log story where you can exactly know, all the way from the user level down to exactly what commands and connections that were made from the system call level, right? So it's a full activity audit. Again, something that's unique to Sysdig that we provide for our customers that are running in Kubernetes at scale. And then building on this EKS kind of story, where this was a customer where that was the exact problem, where they wanted to track any sort of modifications that were happening by the platform developers, and then capture what were some user-facing roles being created. Was this a routine operation, or was this actually something that's suspicious? So again, the Sysdig detection, via Sysdig Secure, allowed them to write those rules on top of the API activity. And again, based on Falco, right? We talked, a lot of these, the detection engine is built and based on the open source Falco. Falco is something that we created, donated to the CNCF. It's now an incubation project. And Falco understands what's happening inside, your kernel, also your audit logs, and allows you to write nice rules and detections on top, and we curate all of those rules in the commercial product and build workflows around it. So now this team could create that in the UI and be able to quickly understand exactly if a modification is happening in a sensitive namespace, alert to the security team, respond with killing the container, for example, all those kinds of things. And then kind of, we talked about workload protection at the agent level. We talked about Kubernetes audit logs, EKS audit logs at the kind of control plane level. Now kind of expanding further, if you are running in AWS, what about your cloud, right? And a lot of times what we see is that the attacks that are real are happening today inside your AWS environments are many times related to some sort of elevated permissions, IAM role changes, right, insider threats. And then teams are looking at, may or may not be looking at CloudTrail, which is a great source of data to identify, these malicious activity that's happening, right? Jonah, thoughts there on kind of what's happening here from your perspective in the AWS infrastructure?
Yeah, you pretty much nailed it, Pavan. We sometimes hyper focus on things like container runtime security, and these things like that, which definitely make a difference. But there's a lot of good guardrails around the blast radius. If one container gets hacked, it's unlikely it's going to cost your company millions of dollars, right? But think about like the biggest exploits that have happened on AWS in the past 3 years. And without naming any names, 2 of them have been S3 data leaks, literally insider threats where people took giant amounts of data from S3 through, some way to they assumed role to get to a higher permission level, took a bunch of data from S3 and sent it out to the internet, right? These are things that could have been caught by CloudTrail, right? And these are things that, if you had some way to monitor this in real time or near real time, they might have been able to be stopped, right? And so these are real threats that happen to companies, and insider threats are, they definitely are real things that we got to think about. So understanding like the API logs of users and seeing what's going on is important.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that we're adding in with this latest release is just elevating into the cloud security and AWS security space where, like you mentioned, right, CloudTrail is a great source of data because a lot of users, services are performing these calls on multiple different services, and this gets recorded in CloudTrail. And then now we're able to ingest those logs, just like we talked about the EKS audit logs. We're ingesting these logs and then extending the detection rules that you already know with the Sysdig platform that you're already using for your container environments, and extending those rules and capabilities to secure your AWS services by writing rules on top of CloudTrail. So now you can say, to your example, the S3 bucket, where if an S3 bucket permission is exposed or encryption is turned off, right? Make sure your team knows about that potential hack or exposure. Or if someone launches a public-facing load balancer or changes some IAM permissions, now you have visibility and security in your AWS. And you can close that gap where before you may be using different tools or different processes. You're bridging that gap with that single platform that allows you to write the policies across containers, hosts, Kubernetes, and AWS environments.
Definitely.
So,
and
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it says EC2 is one of the services there. It's a great call out too. What's encapsulated within the EC2 service is security groups. And that's another common thing we see. People open up a group for debugging purposes and never close it, right?
Right. Exactly. Opening up SSH or something like that, and then having that, open to the public is a common misconfiguration, right? So things like that are definitely things you want to track for. So kind of summarizing again, we talked about workload protection, we talked about EKS audit logs, we talked about CloudTrail for AWS services. So really the benefits here, the first thing is depth. So you really get the depth with Falco being the kind of the common denominator here. That's an open source based detection engine, has a lot of rules that are from the community, right? These are out of the box. So it's all curated for you in the commercial product, but again, you have a community that's driving these rules, right? That's a big difference based on open standards and open approach, and there's no vendor lock-in here. And then you can save time with some of these out-of-the-box policies or create your own ones in Secure as well. And then breadth is really another key category where, what we often see in the market with other tools that are in kind of the CSPM, cloud security posture management space, is they kind of pull the different service APIs. But we believe that kind of going to a central security tab like CloudTrail is just beneficial because, if you're writing everything to CloudTrail, you can pull that specific the logs from that and then write rules. And then also it's just faster for you, right? Because rather than waiting for a vendor create new set of rules and for a new service that takes time, you can respond quickly to any sort of threats if you're adopting new services, but just writing those rules, sending it to CloudTrail and writing rules off of that. And then it's a single policy interface where other tools in the market might have you to learn, they've acquired different companies and they still have different kind of interfaces and the language. Whereas here you have that Falco language that you have to learn once, that allows you to write that, have a single interface to write those rules across these different entities of containers, hosts, Kubernetes, and AWS with all of that rich context that can also be managed as code, as bundle these policies. You can put them into a GitHub repo and have that as part of your version control kind of automation workflow. So we covered image scanning in runtime, kind of moving into compliance now, where we often see this as a big trigger. And we kind of believe in helping customers validate compliance across the lifecycle. So as they deploy, onto EKS, right, validating the cluster configuration with CI's benchmarks for Kubernetes, and for the Docker runtime, the configuration based on the Docker bench, and then scanning for compliance controls as part of your image scanning is a great way to introduce and shift compliance left based on those policies, and then validating compliance at runtime. So these are, again, runtime rules based on Falco mapped to the different compliance standards, right, and controls. So we do that mapping for you. This is a big pain point where customers often say, okay, I don't know how to implement compliance because I don't know what controls I need to check for. We actually do that heavy lifting, map the controls, and allow you to just run those policies so that if something does get violated, you know exactly which control, which check policy, which framework, all of that. And then having an audit trail, again, is a great way to show evidence to an auditor. So if something did happen, you have a full audit log, forensics evidence that serves as a proof of compliance to an auditor, kind of keeps them off your back as well, right? So it's a big benefit there. And then another example here where we're seeing a lot of customers as they move to SaaS, as they deploy more on AWS, right, triggers compliance check requirements like SOC 2 in this customer case where they wanted to achieve SOC 2, and it was so important that their revenue and customer acquisition was impacted by this, by not passing these audits, where we came in and helped provide coverage in multiple areas of intrusion detection, file integrity monitoring, OS hardening, right, general security monitoring. Covering those areas just made it faster for them to meet these audits than they were doing before, and their revenue team actually sponsored the deal. So kind of was a very time sensitive and a critical deal for them to complete in order to serve their customers better. And then lastly, audit and forensics. So not forgetting about forensics, where we, at the very beginning of the presentation, we talked about average lifespan being 5 minutes. So having the ability to respond with a detailed record is crucial. So we can provide this activity audit that we'll show you just in a minute in the demo, helping you capture all these events before and after, and having that forensics evidence is something that's extremely critical even after that container is gone. So you can show proof of compliance, you can respond with more forensics data, and have a confidence in exactly what happened, right? That's pretty important. And this is an example of Goldman Sachs here that deploys Sysdig, where they were solving both the visibility and a security gap. Where from a visibility standpoint, they wanted deep kind of visibility into host, process, network metrics, and being able to map the connections in real time. And we gave them kind of detailed topology maps that they could see based on their own lens of choice, help them understand the communications and connectivity. And then on the detection and security side, we actually mapped every single runtime Falco rule to the MITRE attack framework. So their security teams, SOC teams understood MITRE because they were using it for their on-prem workloads, wanted that same kind of categorization for containers, because they might not understand namespaces in Kubernetes, but they understand lateral movement or privilege escalation. So that helped them determine the severity and respond to incidents faster across your SOC for over 100,000 nodes. So just helping kind of bridge that gap. Like many of you said, it's a shared responsibility between security and DevOps, right? And this is kind of the gap that we help bridge, where we help tie those functionalities and workflows in Kubernetes, and that the DevOps teams understand to their security counterparts, so that they can have a better collaboration and a better handoff. Right? So that's kind of one of the key areas from a process, workflow, and a culture that we're also helping address. Great, so it's time for the last poll question, number 3.
All right, let's go ahead and push out this final polling question here. Let's see. I want to make sure that I'm pushing out the right one. Here it is. What security areas are a priority for your team to address? You can select from scanning vulnerabilities in CI/CD pipelines and registries, detecting threats across containers and AWS accounts or services, meeting compliance standards such as PCI, NIST, or SOC 2, or capturing a detailed audit trail to respond to breaches. So once again, I'll give you guys a couple seconds to go ahead and make your selection. And while we are waiting, a quick reminder that any time is a good time to go ahead and submit any questions that you have for either Jonah or Pavan. We will hopefully have a few minutes near the end of today's webinar to go through audience questions. So I'd love to see as many questions as we can come through and have a spirited conversation around them. Okay, I'll give everybody a couple minutes, or sorry, a couple more seconds to go ahead and make your selection, and then I will go ahead and close things out. And okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now and share the results. What security areas are a priority for your team to address? Looks like we have a dead tie for first between scanning vulnerabilities in CI/CD pipelines and registries, and detecting threats across containers and AWS accounts and services. What do you guys think? Sounds like the market in general?
Yeah, I think I'll let Jonah speak as well, but from my end, I think what this kind of tracks, where a lot of times DevOps teams are getting started and their first kind of use cases are to address scanning. And then I think we're starting to see more runtime security become a use case that we're being asked for, which is why I'm actually surprised that the detecting threats is the same level as scanning. I was expecting it to be less. Jonah, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I definitely agree that threats across accounts and services is definitely a high priority. And scanning itself is just tricky. I think many people scan, but it's almost like a fine art nowadays. Like there's like scanning 101 to like the super advanced scanner club, because there's so many false positives and different scanning algorithms and engines, right? So I do understand how that is a focus, right?
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. That was a great insight. So kind of jumping into why Sysdig and kind of covering the key areas of why we're unique. First reason is, we're able to collect this granular data, right? We sit on the kernel, have visibility into all the system calls that traverse the kernel, and then send all that data back to our backend, right? So it's non-invasive. It's a 1 to 2% performance hit. It's a low performance. We've optimized the agent. So just the ability for you to be non-invasive, collect that rich data from the kernel that never lies. And then we take all that data and then enrich it with the context. And this is kind of the secret sauce, where we automatically do this in minutes, where all that data is collected, and then you immediately see it from a service lens, application lens, right? The logical side of it. And then this also allows you to tie back those vulnerabilities back to specific services and namespaces and applications pretty quickly, right? And then, or if it's a issue or performance issue or a security event that happened, not just telling you that this occurred, but mapping it back to a specific application that's suffering, or potentially exposed. So all of this kind of happens natively and then automatically pretty quickly without you having to do anything. We automatically ingest all your labels. And then a third big reason, again, is being built on open source. So we talked a little bit about this, where we leverage 4 key open source feeds, Anchor Engine open source for the vulnerability analysis. We extend Prometheus across clusters and clouds. So we are talking a lot about security, but we also are able to do a lot with Prometheus if that's of interest. And then Falco, again, our bread and butter for runtime security. This is our baby. We created it, so it's part of the commercial product as well. Just a commercial workflow around Falco for the runtime security. And then Sysdig open source that gives you the ability to do all that troubleshooting and forensics. That's kind of deep visibility. And then on top of all this, we add the workflows, the context, enrichment, the scale in the platform to help DevOps teams, security teams, DevSecOps teams ship applications fast, but also securely. And then being a SaaS first platform and being built for DevOps is another big thing where, we're SaaS first, where, if you're a smaller DevOps team or just a DevOps team that doesn't want to manage the overhead of maintaining a product and the back end and all of that, we have a SaaS model that is unique in the market, that's also sort of something that a lot of our customers have seen value in. And then being built for DevOps, where we integrate into the tools that they use, so scanning directly in the CI/CD tools, the registries, running in your environments, whether it's on AWS or on-prem, if you're moving OpenShift environments on-prem to AWS. So we're wherever you are, essentially, is where we can help secure your applications and then give you that visibility and security on top. And then from a response standpoint, plugging into the tools that your developers are using and love, like PagerDuty or Slack or ServiceNow, and then forwarding events to SIEM tools like Splunk or AWS Security Hub is another great way to make sure that this fits into your existing DevOps workflow, right? So now let's just do a quick demo so you can see the product in action. I'm going to maximize this. And then what you're seeing kind of here, I'll cover this briefly, but starting kind of at the very beginning, you can get started with the Sysdig agent and deploy pretty easily. We provide a set of guided onboarding steps to help you set up the agent. It's a single line agent install, integrate with the Kubernetes audit log, set up scanning, runtime. So really a guided process to help you start getting visibility and security. And then typically what customers do is start in the overview page. This kind of gives you a macro level view of what's going on across both build and runtime. So you can see images that are passing or failing in your registry that are currently running, right? You can see CVEs by different severity levels, critical, high, both in build and run, and then also runtime policy events, so threats that might be occurring or other potential malicious activity by severity levels. And again, we talked a little bit about service vision, and this is kind of how you see it in action, where within 2 clicks, I can go into this specific AWS cluster and then go into a specific application, right? This is really easy because you go from a micro level view all the way down to a specific application in context and see all this information in that context, right? And then I can go into the failed images currently running that are failing my policy and understand kind of what those images are. They're all failing here, right? And I can actually drill into that image and see the details of the policies that were triggered, the vulnerabilities, both OS and non-OS. I don't think this exists in this one, but this is a big thing where we talked about where 53% of non-OS packages that we're finding have high to critical CVEs, so you can scan and report on those. So it's a great way to kind of see all the policy in one place. And you can also set up alerts that allow you to notify your teams if an unscanned image pops up or a scan result changes or a new CV gets updated, notify via Slack or any other tool of choice that you have. And then that's beyond just kind of the runtime reporting. One way to kind of prevent these vulnerabilities early and catch them early is to embed them into your CI/CD pipeline pre-deployment. So we have out-of-the-box policies for Dockerfile best practices, compliance standards, that can allow you to check for various parameters, like making sure no vulnerability exists, either OS or non-OS, that is high severity CVE, maybe potentially the misconfigurations we talked about, and I think Jonah mentioned as well, making sure that you're not running the user line, you're not exposing SSH, you're not running as root, or embedding AWS secrets and access keys. All this that might be human oversight or misconfigurations by a developer, you can catch that early. And then we integrate into your pipeline. So directly in the pipeline, you can see exactly why your build failed. So this example, this build failed. This was the reason. It was an exposed SSH in a Docker file and some other vulnerabilities that were found. You can see all of that. So the benefit, again, is the developer can know exactly why their build failed. And before they move on to a different module, rebuild this image with the right fix and redeploy fast, right? So that's scanning in a nutshell. And then moving into kind of the runtime section, right? We talked a little bit about the runtime threat detection. So this was also a big, of interest in the poll. And you can see all the rules here that we have in the library. All this is based on Falco, and then all tagged for you, so to make it easy, based on compliance standards like NIST, PCI, SOC 2, and other kind of MITRE attack frameworks, so exfiltration, lateral movement, and then just kind of Kubernetes overall tags. So you can see kind of, control plane checks. This is based on the audit logs that we're talking about, right? Someone execing into a pod or starting a node port service, but also other rules to the, someone launching a privileged pod, for example. And then with the CloudTrail that we talked about, you can also see all these CloudTrail rules that are nice, that allow you to kind of see things in AWS, someone deleting encryption, deactivating MFA, starting an AWS user, right? All these kind of CloudTrail-based rules that come out of the box, and then you can also just kind of easily modify and make some changes to these policies using what you already have that's built in. And then if I jump into overview again, so those were some of the policies that you saw that are available for you. Now let's take the example of something actually occurring and how do you respond to that. So if I go into events, unified events feed, sorry, I went kind of fast, but I jumped from overview, going a macro level, jumping into exactly what happened, and you get dropped into this events feed that's a unified feed, ties together runtime events, image scanning results, right? So you can kind of see, okay, what's been happening over the last, 6 hours, 3 days, and you can see someone shelled into a container, or there's a CloudTrail event that happened, or someone modified a config map, or crypto mining, right? Jonah talked about this. So you can see all of this unified in one pane and define these policies with one single interface. Just makes it easy for you to see and react to things faster. So let's take this example of a shell in a container, and then one of the things that we can do is just see all the activity that's surrounding this shell in a container. So this is unique to Sysdig, where we can show you that when this shell in a container happened in Kubernetes, we saw this exec session happen, plus all these system events, and we correlate all that for you, so you can see it in context, right, of that event. So when the shell in a container occurred, we saw someone execing into a pod, right, from this IP, and then they bashed in, curled down some URL, right? Here's the commands that they ran. So all this kind of audit, full audit trail, even after the Kubernetes kills this container, is really powerful for you to understand exactly what's happening, whether it's a routine operation or whether it's something malicious. And then finally, from the incident response side, going into captures here, this is a optional thing where you have this capability to take a capture of all the system calls if something does occur, like a terminal shell, it's severe enough where you want a forensics evidence. And it just basically takes a dump of all the system calls. So similar to Wireshark, where you have a dump of all your network packets in a PCAP, you have this kind of dump in a system call, all system calls in an SCAP, and then full kind of forensics workflow that allows you to kind of go really deep and say, okay, what files were touched or commands that were run, things of that nature. And then I can kind of go into some more detail and see exactly what happened, and go and analyze this in a lot more granularity. And this kind of gives you that single source of data to respond to breaches even after they occur, even after the container is gone, and then show this as proof of compliance to an auditor, right? So really kind of beneficial there. So just to summarize, scanning, right, runtime security, compliance that also allows you to kind of see compliance posture for different controls and see the pass-fail percentage, incident response, and forensics, right? So those are kind of the, in a nutshell. So jumping back, just the last few things here that I wanted to cover. So again, at a high level, Sysdig Secure DevOps platform built on open source, converges Sysdig Secure and Monitor into a single platform, thereby helping cloud teams ship faster by converging those two into a single workflow. So if the content was exciting and educational, and you want to get your hands on the product and give it a spin, we have a 30-day free trial that's available for Sysdig Secure, Sysdig Monitor that we didn't talk about much, but if that's of interest, you can get a free trial of that, or the overall platform, and you can just freely explore all the use cases. This is 30-day free, no credit card required, and you can go to sysdig.com/company/free trial and sign up and see the product in action. And then we also have some great upcoming webinars around simplifying Kubernetes security and operations with IBM, exploring Kubernetes 1.19 in more detail. This is via Alex Ellis, who's a CNCF ambassador, that goes kind of deep, hands-on in terms of what are the new things in 1.19. And then another webinar around Prometheus and really talking about some of the best practices when picking exporters in PROM, dashboards and alerts that you should use, that we'll talk about as well. Great. So with that, we'll take any questions, but thank you so much for listening, and great having you on, Jonah.
Yeah, it was great being on, Pavan.
All right, guys, we are 4 minutes to the top of the hour, so I think we can do one question, and then we'll have to wrap it up. But please know, if you did submit a question and we don't get to it, the folks at Sysdig and AWS will be getting a copy of all the questions that came in, so they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline to get your question answered. Here's a question for you. Does this product work with multi-cloud environments?
Yes, it does. So we support, Google, AWS, Azure, IBM Cloud, any of the services. And if you're running the managed Kubernetes, you can deploy as a daemon set as well. So flexible deployment, flexible multi-cloud option.
Woohoo, okay. All right, well, like I said before, we really only had time for that one question. So please, if you do have a question for our guys, please you can still submit it. And like I said before, they'll be getting a copy of all the questions that came in. So I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline to get your question answered. Also, real quick, want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Okay, I did mention at the top of the hour we would be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and do that. Our first winner today is Michael N. Congratulations, Michael. Second winner today is, let's see, Monica R. Congratulations, Monica. Third winner today is, let's see, Andrew H, I believe it is. Congratulations, Andrew. And our final winner today is Judith L. Congratulations, Judith. And we'll be following up with all 4 of you offline via email to get your Amazon gift card over to you. So please check your inbox. If you don't see it in your inbox, please check your spam folder. Jonah and Pavan, please, well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, a great presentation. Good stuff all the way around. So thanks again for your time. Love it.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much.
All right. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I am now signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.